1907, Missouri. The orphanage that hid its children. None were ever officially buried. They called it Mercy House, though mercy was never what it offered. It rose from the soaked soil of Blackwater, Missouri, in the autumn of 1907, a white structure overlooking the drowned remnants of the town below. The floods had left the people hollow, and when the nuns came with their promises of salvation, no one questioned the sudden appearance of money, lumber, and hands to build it. From a distance, the orphanage looked like grace itself, clean lines, pale shutters, and a wooden cross that caught the light like a blade. But up close, the air around it always seemed still, too heavy for wind, too damp for sunlight. Even the birds avoided its roof. Inside, the floors moaned as if remembering every footstep that had crossed them, and the smell, faint, sweet, and wrong, never quite faded, no matter how often they scrubbed the walls with lye and prayer. The first children arrived before the leaves had fallen. There were 12 of them, brought from the river towns where sickness still lingered. They came barefoot, thin, eyes wide from hunger and hope. The sisters greeted them with smiles that did not reach their eyes. Mother Adeline, the one who led them, had a voice that slipped into the air like oil, smooth and hard to wash away. The townsfolk watched her from afar and said she was a holy woman, touched by God's patience. Yet there were whispers, small ones, about how she never seemed to eat, how her hands were always gloved even in the heat, and how the bell in the orphanage tower sometimes rang in the dead of night when no wind moved through the valley. No one wanted to question grace, not when they were still rebuilding their lives. Mercy House was a blessing, they said. A blessing for those left behind. As winter crawled across the hills, the laughter of the children grew quieter. At first, the people assumed it was the cold that had driven them indoors. But when the snow fell thick and the road became a wall of ice, no one saw the children again. Smoke still curled from the orphanage chimneys, hymns still drifted faintly across the frozen fields, but something inside those walls had changed. The sound of the hymns was wrong, too slow, too mournful, as if the voices were being guided by something unseen. The notes lingered too long, slipping between human and something else entirely. Some nights, the townsfolk would swear they saw candles flickering in every window at once, though no one could say for certain if it was light or reflection, prayer or warning. Mother Adeline's daily routine never wavered. Every morning she walked the perimeter of the orphanage before dawn, gloved hands clasped, lips moving soundlessly. In the faint blue light she appeared almost sculpted, rigid, perfect, untouched by frost. Inside, the sisters whispered of her devotion, of how she spent hours alone in the cellar, tending to what she called the chapel of the unspoken. They said she prayed for the lost souls of the children who had died before finding a home. But there were no records of burials, no small graves behind the house, no markers in the frozen earth. Only a patch of ground where the snow never seemed to settle, dark and soft as breath. There was one sister, young and trembling, who tried to leave that winter. Her name was never written down. She packed her things at night, crossed herself in the dark, and slipped out through the service door. They found her 2 days later by the riverbank, frozen solid, her face turned toward the hill. Her body was clean, her eyes open, and a faint white residue dusted her lips, salt, the townsfolk thought, though the river had long since frozen. The sisters said she had wandered away in confusion, delirious from illness. They buried her quickly. No one attended the service except Mother Adeline, who sang a hymn that no one recognized and ended it with a smile that left the gravedigger uneasy for weeks. Inside Mercy House, time began to slow. The lamps burned lower, the walls seemed to pulse with warmth, and the air took on a heaviness like the inside of a tomb. Each morning, Mother Adeline would ring the bell before dawn, a slow and deliberate toll that echoed through the town like a warning no one dared interpret. And in the evenings, she gathered what remained of the children in the great hall and made them recite verses not found in any scripture. Her voice, steady and calm, told them they were chosen, that their suffering was a bridge to something purer. The children repeated her words with hollow eyes, their small hands folded tightly as if holding back a secret too large to speak. When spring finally came, the road to the orphanage was nearly swallowed by mud. Travelers who passed by said the windows were shuttered, the garden overgrown, and the bell tower cracked in two. But smoke still rose from the chimney, faint and gray. No one had the courage to climb the hill. The town had learned to live with its silence the way one learns to live with a scar, by pretending it has always been there. And when they prayed at night, they avoided saying the name of the house altogether, as if its very mention might wake something that had only grown hungrier with time. Yet the hill remembers. The earth beneath Mercy House breathes in shallow gasps, waiting for the next voice to fill its halls. Some say you can still hear the hymns on cold nights, drifting faintly through the trees, each note softer than the last, each word an echo of a promise that was never holy. The house stands still, patient and white against the dark sky, and though its walls no longer cry out, they listen. They always listen. Miss Ada Holcomb arrived at Mercy House the winter after the floods, a small woman with steady hands and eyes that never seemed to blink long enough. The townsfolk loved her from the start. She moved through the marketplace with quiet grace, offering bread to the hungry and a listening ear to the broken. Her voice was always soft, her words full of scripture and sympathy. People said that if Mother Adeline was the heart of Mercy House, then Miss Ada was its soul, tender, patient, and endlessly giving. Yet there was something about her that unsettled even the faithful, though no one could ever name what it was. Perhaps it was her stillness, the way she never rushed, the way she seemed to think before every gesture, as if measuring the weight of her goodness. Inside the orphanage, the children adored her. She brushed their hair, stitched their torn sleeves, and whispered stories about angels who guarded the innocent. She told them that every good deed made their souls brighter and that their light was a gift to the Lord. Her praise was soft but exact. A child who spoke too loudly at supper was corrected with a hand on the shoulder, a smile that lingered too long, and the promise that obedience was the truest form of love. She never raised her voice. She never struck. Her discipline was quieter, made of repetition and ritual. Every morning she lined them up by height and inspected their hands, their fingernails, the backs of their necks. Dirt, she said, was the first mark of sin. A clean body meant a clean heart. Some nights she made them scrub the floors until dawn, whispering prayers of purification as she watched. Her kindness was always there, but it cut like frost, cold, bright, and impossible to escape. She kept a ledger in her room, bound in soft brown leather. Inside, the pages were filled with neat, slanted handwriting. Each child's name was written beside a series of marks, not grades, not punishments, but symbols that only Ada understood. Circles, lines, and crosses interwoven like a language of devotion. Sometimes, when she thought no one could hear, she would run her fingers over the marks and hum under her breath, a low sound that was almost tender. She believed she was cleansing them, guiding their spirits toward perfection. When one of the children grew sick, she sat beside their bed for hours, spooning broth into their mouths, wiping their foreheads with cool cloths. If they died, she would not cry. Instead, she would kneel beside the small, still body and murmur that they had been released, that their souls were unstained at last. To her, death was not loss but completion, the final, perfect quiet she had worked so hard to shape. The sisters trusted her completely. They said her presence brought peace to the house, that her discipline kept the children safe. None of them noticed the way she kept the pantry locked, or how she insisted on measuring every portion of bread and milk with an exactness that bordered on reverence. No one questioned why she burned the scraps that went uneaten, or why the fire in her kitchen never went out, even when the rest of the house slept in darkness. Ada believed that waste invited decay, and decay was the breeding ground of sin. She was certain that cleanliness was the path to salvation, that order itself was a form of prayer. Her world was one of measured spoons and folded linens, of whispers before dawn and the sound of her own heartbeat counting down the hours between confessions. There were nights when she stood before her mirror and smiled without moving her eyes. She would study her reflection in the dim candlelight, tracing the corners of her mouth, practicing the expression the children trusted most. That smile, gentle, perfect, unchanging, was her armor. It was what she showed the world so they would not see what burned behind her eyes. Beneath her calm exterior lived a need that never slept, a hunger not for food or flesh, but for control, for the power to shape innocence itself. She believed that purity could be built, molded like clay, if one only had the patience to scrape away everything unworthy. In her mind she was not cruel. She was merciful. The world outside was rotten, and she was its quiet cure. When Mother Adeline spoke of divine order, Ada listened with the devotion of a lover. She began to keep the children's rooms colder, their meals smaller, their prayers longer. Each act was meant to refine them, to strip away weakness. If one of them cried in the night, she would sit beside their bed and stroke their hair, whispering that tears were impurities escaping the soul. She said that those who learned to weep without sound were closest to heaven. The children obeyed her. They learned to smile when she entered, to keep their backs straight and their eyes lowered. They learned that love was not comfort but endurance, and that Ada's approval was the closest thing to grace they would ever know. Sometimes she would stand at the window after curfew, looking down at the town lights below. In those moments, her smile would fade, and her reflection in the glass would seem almost unfamiliar, a face stretched too thin, eyes too bright, lips too pale. She would whisper to herself that she was doing God's work, that the world needed cleansing, that the fire in her kitchen was holy. The wind would rattle the window panes and she would close her eyes, breathing in the faint scent of smoke that clung to her dress. Every rule she made, every punishment she delivered, every prayer she led, all of it fed the quiet order she worshipped more than faith itself. When morning came, she was once again the matron everyone adored. The smile returned, the calm tone, the measured steps. She moved through the halls of Mercy House like a spirit of peace, her shadow stretching long behind her in the pale light. No one saw the ledger hidden beneath her bed, or the way her hands trembled ever so slightly when she turned the key to the pantry door. The children sang their hymns, their voices thin but obedient, and Ada's heart swelled with a strange, radiant satisfaction. The house was clean. The souls were still. Everything was exactly as she intended, perfect, pure, and waiting for what came next. By the second winter, Mercy House had become a world of patterns, the kind that numbed thought and softened fear. Every hour belonged to ritual. Every face, every step, every word spoken was measured. The sisters rose before dawn, washed in silence, and prayed until the first bell rang. The children followed, shuffling through the corridors with blank obedience, their small voices murmuring verses that no longer sounded like hope. Even the light seemed disciplined within those walls, filtered through frosted windows that never let the sun in fully. And somewhere beneath that rhythm, beneath the sound of prayers and footsteps, something else began to move, slow, muffled, patient. It started as a faint tapping beneath the old nursery floor. The first who noticed was Sister Agnes, a timid caretaker who spent her nights darning socks by candlelight. She told herself it was nothing, rats perhaps, or the settling of old beams, but the sound grew steady, like a heartbeat trying to remember its rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, tap. It came only after the children had been put to bed, when the house had fallen into its heavy, suffocating quiet. The first night she mentioned it, Miss Ada smiled gently and said that old would often talk to itself in the cold. The second time, Ada's smile tightened. "It's the rats," she said again, her voice too calm, her eyes not quite meeting hers. "Keep the children still during prayers. Restless souls make restless sounds." After that, Sister Agnes stopped asking. But the noise didn't stop. It changed. The tapping grew faster after evening prayers, sharp and irregular, like a message trying to claw its way upward. Some nights it seemed to move across the floorboards, tracing the path between the beds, as if something beneath were crawling, searching. The children heard it too. They would wake in the dark, clutching their thin blankets, their breaths shallow as the rhythm swelled beneath them. The braver ones whispered to each other that the floor was breathing, that it listened when they prayed. Others pressed their ears against the wood and said they could hear voices, soft and wet, murmuring words they didn't understand. Miss Ada continued her inspections as always, lantern in hand, gliding down the rows of beds with the same perfect composure. She would pause beside each child, lean close, and whisper her blessing before moving on. Her shadow stretched long and thin across the walls, flickering as the lantern flame trembled. Every night she reached the nursery, the tapping would stop. Not fade, stop, as if the sound itself held its breath when she approached. Then, as soon as her footsteps retreated down the hall, it would begin again, faster, louder, desperate. The children never told her. They had learned that silence pleased her most. Then came the first disappearance. His name was Caleb, 7 years old, quiet, always the last to finish his meals. He had a habit of counting the buttons on his coat whenever he was afraid. One morning, his bed was neatly made, his shoes placed perfectly beside it. His name was scratched from the attendant's ledger before breakfast. Miss Ada announced that Caleb had been transferred to another home, one closer to the city. The sisters nodded. The children said nothing. But that night, when the lights went out, one of the younger girls swore she heard tapping from under Caleb's empty bed. Faint at first, then steady, then frantic. Within days, other things began to vanish. A pillow, a blanket, a small wooden cross from the nursery wall. Each time Ada offered a calm explanation. Repairs, replacements, a new shipment for the parish. Her logic was seamless, her voice steady. Yet beneath her smile, something had sharpened. She began inspecting the nursery twice each night now, her lantern brighter, her gloved hand brushing along the floorboards as she passed. She would pause in the center of the room, head tilted slightly, listening. Her expression never changed, but the children noticed how her fingers twitched when the tapping fell silent. Sister Agnes tried once to pry up a loose plank after curfew. She had heard the sound again, faint, steady, pleading. Her hands trembled as she wedged the tip of a knife beneath the board, and just as it began to lift, the air seemed to shift as if the house itself were holding its breath. Then Ada's voice came from the doorway, calm and distant. "That's not your place, sister." Agnes froze. The knife slipped from her hand. Ada crossed the room, kneeling beside her with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "We mustn't disturb the house while it rests," she whispered. "Everything has its time." The next morning, Sister Agnes was reassigned to the laundry. She never entered the nursery again. The days grew shorter, the windows frostbitten and blind. The children became quieter still. Ada's routines deepened. Every plate aligned, every hymn sung at precisely the same tempo, every breath accounted for. She began ending prayers with a peculiar phrase, one none of the sisters remembered from any scripture. "What is cleansed below shall rise above." The words unsettled them, but no one questioned her. Mother Adeline had grown frail, often confined to her quarters. Mercy House now moved to the rhythm of Ada's will. At night, the sound beneath the floor grew restless. Sometimes it came from one corner, sometimes another, as if something trapped below had begun to roam. The children no longer dared to sleep. They would lie stiff under their blankets, listening as the tapping turned to scraping, long, slow drags that seemed to pull the wood inward. The air in the nursery smelled faintly of iron and lye, though no one could find its source. And when morning came, the smell would fade, replaced by Ada's usual fragrance of soap and rosewater. Then as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. 3 nights of silence. 3 nights of peace that felt wrong, too clean, too deliberate. On the 4th morning, another bed stood empty. This time it belonged to Thomas, one of the older boys. His name vanished from the ledger before anyone asked. His things were gone, and his blanket was tucked so tightly it might have been sewn to the mattress. Miss Ada gathered the children that evening and told them Thomas had been called to serve elsewhere, a home that needed him more. Her voice was soft, almost loving. Then she led them in prayer, her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Afterward, when the lights dimmed and the hallways fell still, a faint new sound replaced the silence, not tapping this time but breathing. Shallow, rhythmic, too steady to be the wind. The children pressed their faces to their pillows, pretending not to hear. Ada stood in the doorway, lantern low, eyes half closed, listening with something close to satisfaction. The house, she thought, was finally learning to keep quiet. Outside, snow fell in perfect silence over Mercy House. The hill glistened pale under the moon, and for a moment, the world seemed still again. But beneath the nursery floor, the boards swelled softly, pulsing in the dark as if something down there had begun to dream. By the 3rd winter, Ada Holcomb no longer spoke of God the way she once had. Her words grew quieter, her scripture more fragmented, her smile sharper around the edges. Mercy House had become a shrine to her own invention, a theology built not on mercy or salvation but on the mechanics of purity. In her journal, she began calling it the doctrine of cleansing, a creed she believed had been revealed to her in the still hours between the final bell and the dawn. She wrote that sin was not a thing of the soul but of the body, a fever that lived beneath the skin, spreading through warmth, through blood, through the pulse of human heat. Only by cooling that heat, by quieting the restless fire of flesh, could one draw out impurity and make the spirit truly clean. She began with the smallest gestures, subtle changes to routine. The dormitories were kept colder, the windows left slightly ajar at night so that the children might breathe the pure air of heaven. Blankets were rationed, replaced with thinner, lighter cloth that she said encouraged resilience. She spoke often of balance, of the danger of warmth, of how comfort softened the will. The sisters, warned by obedience, accepted her explanations. They had grown used to Ada's certainty, her gentle tone that left no room for doubt. Only Sister Agnes, pale and trembling, noticed how Ada's eyes lingered on the youngest children during prayer, her gaze drifting to the faint mist of their breath in the freezing chapel air. The cellar had always been off-limits to the sisters. It was where the stores were kept, where Ada said she managed the heating and supplies. But by late January, a new door appeared at the far end of the stairwell, thick, reinforced, painted the same dull color as the stone around it. No one saw the workers who installed it, though hammering had echoed through the floorboards for weeks. Ada called it the quiet room. She said it was a place for reflection, for those who struggled with sin or disobedience. Only she held the key. Inside that room, Ada built her masterpiece. It began as a table, though in time it became something else entirely, a structure of wood and iron pipes, bound together by her own hands. She lined the walls with wet linens that she changed daily, each one soaked in water drawn from the well and blessed with whispered prayer. She fitted narrow tubes through the ceiling, connecting to vents above, allowing air from the frozen outside to flow down into the chamber. The pipes hissed softly when opened, releasing a breath so cold it burned the lungs. On the table she placed layers of cloth, each one damp and coarse, meant to draw the warmth from skin. In her notes she called it the cooling crucible. It was not meant to harm, she told herself, only to refine. The first child sent there was Lucy, a small girl with hair the color of ash. Lucy had been caught hiding crusts of bread beneath her mattress. Ada explained that hunger was a form of greed, that the body's desires must be tempered like steel. She led the girl down into the cellar, her voice calm, her hand resting lightly on the child's shoulder. The sisters heard nothing for hours. When Ada emerged, her cheeks were flushed from the cold and her gloves were damp. She told them that Lucy was resting, that she had found peace through stillness. The next morning Lucy's bed was empty, her name erased from the ledger. Ada announced that she had been transferred to a convent hospital to recover her strength. The story fit neatly into the silence that ruled the house. The quiet room became a secret liturgy. Each session, as Ada called it, followed the same sequence. The child was led into the cellar after night prayers, told to kneel and confess their faults. Ada would anoint their foreheads with cold water, her lips moving in a prayer of her own making. Then she would bind their wrists loosely to the table, lay the damp linens over their bodies and open the vents above. The air would rush in, thin, metallic and biting, until the child began to shiver uncontrollably. She would lean close then, whispering that the shaking was the body's sin leaving through the pores, that they must not resist. "Whisper your prayer," she would say softly. "Whisper until it stops." The words became a rhythm, a chant only she could hear. Some lasted minutes, others hours. When the trembling ceased, she would close the vents, remove the linens, and sit beside the still form, her face serene, her breath fogging faintly in the freezing air. Each night after a cleansing, Ada recorded her observations in the ledger. Pulse slowed. Temperature lowered. No signs of agitation. Spirit quiet. Her handwriting remained neat, even elegant. She began sketching diagrams, cross-sections of the human body, notes about circulation, margin annotations about soul currents. The sisters who glimpsed her notebooks mistook them for medical studies sent from the parish, though none dared ask. The truth was simpler and darker. Ada no longer prayed for guidance. She was inventing her own salvation. The more she perfected her method, the more convinced she became that she was chosen for a higher calling. She spoke less of Christ and more of the great stillness, an eternal coldness that awaited the pure. To her, death was not the end but the final cooling, the perfect cleansing of all warmth, all want. She began wearing lighter dresses even in the snow, claiming the cold preserved her clarity. Her touch grew gentler, her words more affectionate. The children, terrified but desperate for approval, clung to her kindness like light in a blizzard. She called them her white hearts, her angels of frost. Sister Agnes broke her silence once, months later. She told Mother Adeline that the quiet room frightened her, that Ada's eyes had changed. Mother Adeline, weak and ill, only shook her head and murmured that Ada was doing what must be done to preserve order. "We cannot question grace," she whispered. But even she refused to go near the cellar anymore. By the time spring thawed the fields outside, Mercy House no longer smelled of soap or candle wax but of cold stone and damp linen. The pipes beneath the floor groaned softly, carrying unseen drafts through the halls. The remaining children spoke in hushed tones, their voices fragile, their skin pale and thin as paper. Each night, they prayed longer, whispering through trembling lips, their words fading into the same rhythm that once came from beneath the floorboards. And Ada, serene, meticulous Ada, listened from the shadows of the quiet room, her hand resting on the cooling apparatus, her eyes closed in reverence. To her, the silence of the house was no longer absence. It was proof. Proof that the fire of sin had finally been stilled. Above her, the beams of Mercy House creaked under the weight of their secrets, the sound almost like breathing. The doctrine of cleansing was complete. By the fourth winter the children no longer feared the cold. Fear had become something quieter, something they carried inside like a small, steady flame. Miss Ada said that was good. That fear was the spark of the soul struggling to burn clean. The fires of Mercy House had long gone out in their hearts, but every corridor still glowed faintly with candlelight. There were candles everywhere now, in the chapel, in the dining hall, on the steps, along the cellar stairs. Ada had filled the house with them, tall and thin, white and unscented, each one molded by her own hands. She spoke of wax the way priests spoke of grace. It was pure, she said, obedient to heat, capable of taking any shape the light demanded. When melted, it surrendered itself completely, and that, she whispered, was the truest form of faith. The candle ritual began as a sermon, one of many small inventions in Ada's growing theology. During evening prayers, she would light a single taper and lift it before the congregation of shivering children. Her eyes would shimmer in the glow as she spoke about the body as a vessel, soft, imperfect, shaped by sin. "The flame teaches us," she would murmur. "It burns what is weak and leaves what endures." The children would repeat her words until their voices became a low hum that filled the chapel, steady and dull, like bees trapped in glass. At first, it seemed harmless, the kind of strange ceremony that Mercy House had grown used to. But Ada was no longer content with symbols. Her faith demanded proof. She began spending her afternoons in the kitchen, where she kept an iron pot over a low flame. The sisters assumed she was preparing wax for the altar candles, but the process was too precise, too obsessive. She would weigh each block of wax on a small brass scale, then stir the melting pool slowly, rhythmically, until it thickened to the texture of honey. She wrote careful notes about temperature, about how long it took for the wax to cool into solidity again. She learned how to keep it just warm enough to mold, how to stretch the moment between liquid and stillness. In her mind, that moment was divine, the crossing point between flesh and purity. The first flame baptism, as she later called it, took place on a Thursday night. The house was silent except for the low hum of the boiler and the wind pressing against the windows. Ada led 3 children into the chapel, their small hands clutching candles she had made herself. She told them they were chosen, that they had been found worthy of rebirth. The ritual, she said, would hurt, but only because their sins were clinging too tightly to their skin. She poured the wax carefully, 1 spoonful at a time, over the back of each child's hand. It was not enough to burn deeply, just enough to make them gasp. She told them the pain was holy, that the sting was the sound of their souls being scrubbed clean. They cried, softly, obediently. When the wax cooled, she peeled it away in long translucent curls and held it to the light, smiling as if she had caught something invisible within it. "See," she whispered. "It leaves the body clean." The sessions multiplied. Each night she refined her method, the angle of the pour, the distance of the flame, the pace of her words. Soon she no longer needed the other sisters' help. The chapel became her sanctuary, her laboratory, her altar. The wax changed too. She began mixing it with oil to slow the cooling, to let the warmth linger longer against the flesh. She would test it on herself first, dipping her fingers into the pot, watching the pale coating form and harden, admiring how the heat brought blood to the surface. Her notebooks filled with more diagrams, more equations, the mathematics of purification. In one margin she wrote, "Heat equals truth." Each baptism followed the same structure. The children were called one by one, their faces pale and glistening with candlelight. They were told to kneel and whisper their faults, lying, greed, envy, disobedience, even the smallest unkind thought. For each confession, Ada melted a new candle. She said that every sin deserved its own flame, and each flame its own mark. The wax would be poured in patterns, small circles on their shoulders, thin streams down their forearms, delicate drips at the corners of their mouths. She insisted that the wax carried prayer through the skin, sealing purity into the flesh. The screams when they came were brief. The house had learned to swallow sound. When the ritual was finished, Ada would press a kiss to each child's forehead, whispering, "You are light now. You will not burn again." Her face during these rites was serene, the calm of someone utterly certain. The sisters, when they glimpsed her work, saw only the glow of candles and the children kneeling in silence, heads bowed. They told themselves it was devotion, a strange but holy kind. No one dared question the marks left behind, the pale red traces hidden beneath sleeves. The smell of melted wax became the scent of the orphanage, seeping into the wood, into the hair of the children, into Ada's own skin. It clung to her like a blessing she could never wash away. There was a strange beauty in her madness. Every action was deliberate, clean, performed with the precision of a surgeon and the reverence of a priest. She believed utterly in her work, that pain, properly administered, was not cruelty but revelation. "Only through the flame can the soul forget its shadow," she wrote. And she began to speak less of God altogether, referring instead to the light, a force she claimed could pass through her hands. Her followers, the youngest children, the ones too frightened to disobey, began calling her Mother Flame in whispered reverence. The name made her eyes shine. As the rituals grew more frequent, the candles burned lower. The walls of the chapel darkened with soot, the floor littered with pools of hardened wax like the remains of shed skin. Ada moved through it all with quiet devotion, collecting the cooled fragments and storing them in small jars labeled with the children's names. She said that their purity must be preserved, that their light, once released, should never be wasted. The sisters never saw what she did with the jars afterward, but the cellar beneath the chapel began to smell faintly of smoke and iron once more. When spring returned, the hill bloomed again, but Mercy House remained wrapped in perpetual twilight. The candles burned day and night now, 1,000 tiny flames whispering against the dark. The children walked more slowly, their eyes unfocused, their hands covered in faint scars that Ada called marks of grace. Every night, the hymns grew quieter, more like breathing than song. And Ada, standing before her congregation of pale, trembling faces, lifted her candle high and smiled her perfect smile. The flame flickered once, then steadied, its light soft and pure. She whispered that the fire had accepted them, that it no longer needed to test their faith. But still she kept pouring, kept watching the wax cool, kept listening to the silence that followed. For in that silence, she believed, the soul at last became still enough to shine. It was late autumn when the new assistant arrived. A thin young woman named Clara Hewitt, sent from the parish office to help organize Mercy House's growing paperwork. She was 20, earnest and eager to please, though the journey up the hill left her uneasy. From a distance, the orphanage looked almost peaceful, its white walls gleaming faintly through the trees. But as she stepped inside, the air felt still, muffled, as though sound itself had learned to behave. Miss Ada greeted her warmly, her smile delicate and flawless, her gloved hand cool as porcelain. She said she was grateful for Clara's help, that the Lord's work always multiplied faster than hands could keep up. Clara bowed her head and said she was honored. Yet even then, something in the house pressed against her, a quiet that seemed to listen back. Her task was simple enough at first: catalog letters, receipts, and records from the past 3 years. The parish had begun requesting detailed reports of the orphanage's numbers, arrivals, transfers, adoptions. Mercy House was praised for its efficiency, its near-perfect order. But as Clara settled into the office beside the chapel, she noticed that certain details never aligned. The number of children listed on one month's report would shrink by 2 or 3 the next, without explanation. Letters marked as sent had no postage, and half the envelopes were sealed with blank paper inside. She asked about it once, timidly, and Ada's reply was calm but firm. "Some children move on quietly," she said. "It is better that way." After that, Clara kept her questions to herself. The longer she worked, the more she sensed the weight of something hidden beneath the clean ink and crisp paper. Every document seemed rehearsed, every word measured to appear holy. But behind the phrasing of grace and order, the truth whispered. There were phrases that repeated in every file: purified, released, ascended. And always the final line, written in Ada's elegant hand: their silence is their salvation. At night, when she worked alone, Clara would catch the faint smell of wax and damp linen drifting through the cracks of the floorboards. The children's footsteps upstairs were soft, synchronized, like a clock ticking in rhythm with her heartbeat. One evening, while searching for an adoption certificate, Clara found a locked drawer at the bottom of Ada's desk. The key hung oddly beside the chapel door. No one was in the office. Her hands trembled as she turned the lock and lifted the drawer open. Inside was a single book, smaller than a ledger, bound in faded leather. The cover was unmarked. She opened it slowly, expecting accounts or donations, but what she saw instead were names. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Each written in the same narrow, slanted script. There were no birth dates, no family records, no destinations. Only 3 columns beside each name. Temperature. Duration. Result. Clara turned the pages in silence. The entries were clinical, almost scientific. The first numbers were mild, 78 degrees, 6 hours. Others grew colder, longer. 72 degrees. 8 hours. Cleanse. 65 degrees. 10 hours. Cleanse. Every line ended the same way, the same word repeating until it lost meaning. Cleansed, cleansed, cleansed. She found Lucy's name. She remembered hearing Ada mention her once, and beside it the note, cooled to stillness. No tremors. Complete. Clara's stomach twisted. The handwriting was beautiful, steady, patient. There were small symbols in the margins. Circles, triangles, faint sketches of pipes and coils. She flipped to the most recent page and found the names of children she had seen that very morning. Their entries were half-filled, awaiting completion. She snapped the book shut, her pulse pounding in her throat. The air in the office felt colder now, the candle flame thin and wavering. From the hallway came the faint sound of humming, Ada's voice, slow and tuneless, moving closer. Clara stuffed the ledger into her satchel and blew out the candle just as the door opened. Ada stood framed in the light, her face serene. "Working late?" she asked softly. Clara nodded too quickly. Ada's eyes lingered on the satchel. "Good," she said at last. "The records must be perfect. Paper is the language of the soul's memory." Her tone was kind, almost tender, but something in it made Clara's chest tighten. That night Clara could not sleep. She lay awake in the small room the sisters had given her, the ledger hidden beneath her pillow. Outside, the wind scraped against the windows. Below, somewhere in the depths of the house, she thought she heard the faint hiss of pipes, the rhythmic pulse of something mechanical breathing in the dark. At dawn she decided to leave. She would take the ledger down the hill to the parish office, to anyone who would listen. But when she rose, the hall was already filled with Ada's voice leading morning prayer. The words echoed through the corridor like a spell, "What is cleansed below shall rise above." Clara moved quickly, keeping her eyes down, clutching her satchel. As she reached the front door she paused. The latch was cold, unyielding. From the corner of her eye she saw movement, Ada standing at the end of the hallway, her gloved hands folded neatly before her. Her expression was gentle, almost sad. "Leaving so soon?" she asked. Clara stammered something about an errand, but Ada only tilted her head. "Take care in the cold," she said softly. "It finds what is unfinished." And then she smiled. That smile, perfect, weightless, eternal, followed Clara down the steps, through the frost, into the gray light of morning. No one in town saw her again. A week later, the parish received a letter from Mercy House explaining that Miss Hewitt had taken ill and been transferred to a hospital in St. Louis. The letter was signed by Ada Holcomb, its tone compassionate, its spelling flawless. The parish sent prayers and never wrote back. The ledger, of course, was never found. The locked drawer remained empty. Years later, when the orphanage was abandoned and its records catalogued by the diocese, no mention of Clara appeared in any official file. The names of the children ended abruptly that same winter. No explanations, no transfers, no deaths recorded. Only the final page, written in Ada's hand, discovered at the back of a forgotten archive, one line, centered neatly on the yellowed paper, "All accounted for. All cleansed." By the summer of 1911, the rains that had once drowned Blackwater no longer came. The air turned brittle, the earth split in quiet agony, and the orchards that framed Mercy House began to wither beneath a sun that seemed intent on punishment. Each day the sisters carried buckets from the river, their arms trembling with the weight, their prayers cracked and hollow. The children's songs had long ceased, replaced by a silence that no drought could explain. Even the insects avoided the hill now. Only the flies remained, drifting lazily around the orchard where the air smelled faintly of iron and rot. Beneath the apple trees, a small stone well had stood for years, half hidden by weeds, its mouth sealed with a warped wooden lid. No one had used it since the early days of the orphanage. Ada had declared the water unfit for holiness, and ordered it covered. No one questioned her. No one dared. But as the drought deepened and the main cistern ran dry, desperation forced their return to forgotten places. One morning, 2 older boys were sent to check the old well, to see if it still held water. They lifted the lid and were met not by cool air, but by a foul, heavy stench that crawled up from the depths like a living thing. The smell clung to their clothes, thick and metallic. One of them gagged. The other whispered that the air down there was warm. When they told Sister Agnes, her face went white as plaster. She said nothing to Ada, but that evening she and one of the caretakers returned with lanterns. Together they peered down into the darkness. The light reached farther than they expected. The well was shallow now, nearly dry. At the bottom lay a muddied tangle of white shapes, small and uneven, glistening faintly beneath the lantern glow. For a long time neither of them spoke. Then Sister Agnes dropped the lantern by accident, and the sound that echoed back from below was not the hollow splash of water, but the brittle clatter of bone. By dawn the orchard was alive with whispers. The children huddled near the windows, wide-eyed, while the sisters moved like ghosts through the halls. Mother Adeline, too weak to rise from her bed, muttered prayers that made no sense. When Ada appeared, calm as ever, she listened without emotion as Sister Agnes explained what they had found. Her face remained unreadable, her posture perfect. Then, softly, she said the remains must belong to livestock, pigs, perhaps, buried years ago after disease. She told them to seal the well again to keep the odor from spreading. Her voice left no room for argument. But the look in her eyes was distant, almost fond, as though she were remembering something long buried and perfectly arranged. The townsfolk heard by afternoon. Curiosity carried them up the hill in small, uneasy groups. Men with shovels, women clutching handkerchiefs to their mouths. They found Ada waiting by the orchard, her gloved hands folded, her composure unbroken. She repeated her story with grace. The remains were old farm animals discarded during the orphanage's early years. To prove her goodwill, she allowed the men to take a closer look. They lowered ropes, lowered lanterns, squinted into the dark. At first the story seemed to hold. The bones were small, but the drought had stripped away so much that few could tell what they belonged to. Until one man, a farmer named Weller, reached down with his hook and drew something up from the mire. A skull no larger than a fist, the jaw still intact, the teeth too small, too perfect. He said nothing at first. Just stared at it, the way one might look at an old photograph one does not wish to recognize. Then he dropped it hard into the dust. The crowd went quiet. Someone muttered that pigs didn't have teeth like that. Another whispered a prayer. Ada did not flinch. Decay distorts everything, she said, her tone soft and reasonable. Time makes fools of our eyes. The men hesitated. No one wanted to accuse a woman of God, least of all one who had served through flood and famine. So they let her words settle like dust, and one by one they left, uneasy but silent. Before nightfall, the well was covered again, this time with heavy stones and wooden boards nailed tight. The air in the orchard seemed to thicken afterward, as if sealing the truth within. But Blackwater could not unsee what it had glimpsed. The rumor spread anyway. Mothers whispered that the hill was cursed, that Mercy House had been built upon something unholy. A few fathers came at night with shovels, hoping to dig for proof, but the sisters chased them away with lanterns and prayer books. The sheriff visited once, listened to Ada's calm explanations and left shaking his head. "The woman's a saint," he said to the men at the tavern. "She keeps her house clean, her children fed. You think she'd keep bones in a well?" No one argued. It was easier to believe in livestock than in evil that wore a gentle smile. Inside the orphanage, the children began to dream of water, black, endless, whispering their names from below the orchard. They said the bones were restless, that when the wind blew through the trees, it carried voices. Some nights, the sound was unmistakable, faint tapping, rhythmic and wet, coming from the ground itself. Sister Agnes tried to bless the well, but Ada forbade it. "Do not disturb what sleeps," she warned, her eyes glinting in the candlelight. "Cleansed things do not need forgiveness." As the heat dragged on, the orchard trees died one by one. The apples shriveled and dropped before ripening, littering the dry earth with brown, hollow fruit. The children stopped playing there altogether. Even the sisters avoided the path that led behind the chapel, where the air always seemed cooler though the sun burned everywhere else. At dusk, when the wind shifted, the smell returned, faint but unmistakable. Not decay exactly. Something cleaner. Something that reminded the older sisters of lie and smoke. By September, the drought finally broke. The first rain came without warning, falling in great heavy sheets that flooded the lower fields. But on the hill, the water didn't sink. It rolled down the orchard path in narrow streams, pooling around the stones that covered the well. The earth softened, cracked nails gave way, and by morning the lid had lifted again just slightly. Beneath it, the water shimmered darkly, rippling with the reflection of the house above. The first to notice was a boy fetching firewood. He said he saw faces in the water, pale, eyeless faces staring up, their mouths moving soundlessly as the rain fell harder. When he told Ada, she smiled and placed a hand on his head. "Don't look down there anymore," she said gently. "It's only the past trying to find a voice." The next morning, the well was sealed again, this time with mortar and iron nails. Ada watched as the workers finished, her expression calm, her hands folded over a small black book pressed tight to her chest. By evening, the orchard was quiet. The rain stopped. The house stood white and still against the dark horizon. But deep beneath the stones, the well water stirred faintly, a soft, uneven rhythm, like breath returning to lungs that should have stayed still. By the spring of 1913, Mercy House had become a shadow of itself. The paint on its white walls had peeled to the color of bone, the orchard stood dead and gray, and even the wind seemed to avoid the hill. The townsfolk no longer visited, though they sometimes looked up toward the house from the valley and spoke in hushed tones about the strange lights that glowed from its windows long past midnight. Ada Holcomb still kept her routines, immaculate as ever, her posture unbent by time. She led morning hymns, inspected the dormitories, recorded the day's prayers in her ledger of faith. The sisters followed her in silence, thin and pale from the heat that never seemed to leave the building. And beneath the floors, in the cellar where no one went without permission, the air thrummed faintly with warmth, a steady, unnatural pulse that smelled faintly of wax and soot. The drought had returned that summer, fiercer than before. The grass on the hill turned brittle, and the wooden beams of Mercy House grew dry as tinder. Some nights, the sisters would wake to find the air thick with smoke, only to discover it came from nowhere, a lingering ghost of the old furnace below. Ada told them it was the Lord's reminder that all things must pass through fire to be made pure. The children repeated her words during evening prayer, their small voices trembling in rhythm, like the hush before a storm. The fire began, they said, just before dawn on July 3rd. No lightning struck, no candles were left burning. Yet somehow, flames bloomed at once in every corner of the building, as if the house itself had exhaled and caught a light. Witnesses from the town saw it first from the fields below, a single golden tower rising through the pre-dawn mist. Then the entire hill ignited, bright and silent, so fast that the bells of Blackwater rang too late. By the time men arrived with buckets and shovels, the orphanage was a living pyre, each window glowing like the eye of a dying god. The fire moved with a strange grace, not wild but deliberate, sweeping from room to room as though following the paths of old prayers. The roof collapsed inward, the walls groaned and folded like paper, and through it all came no screams, no sound of panic, only the soft, rhythmic hum of something that might have been singing. They said Ada was seen then, standing in the doorway as the flames reached the chapel. Her dress was white, untouched, her face serene. Some swore she was holding a child in her arms. Others said she carried nothing at all. She walked slowly into the inferno, her steps measured, her chin lifted as if in reverence. The witnesses below could only watch, rooted in disbelief as the fire swallowed her whole. For a moment, she was outlined in pure gold, her form wreathed in light too bright to look at. Then she was gone. A gust of wind roared across the hill, and the roof caved in with a sound like thunder. Sparks rained down the slope, setting the dry grass ablaze, but even that burned in patterns, circles and lines faintly geometric as though drawn by an unseen hand. By mid-morning, Mercy House was nothing but a smoking skeleton. The air reeked of ash and sugar, a sweetness so thick it made the rescuers cough. They dug through the wreckage expecting to find bodies, but there were none. Not the sisters, not the children, not Ada. The beds had burned clean through, the chapel floor had collapsed, and the beams had melted into black serpents of wood. Yet at the base of the ruin, near what had once been the chapel stairs, the ground remained cold, damp, and utterly untouched. There, beneath layers of soot, they found the entrance to the cellar, intact, its iron door closed, its handle cool. When the sheriff pried it open, a wave of air drifted out, heavy with the scent of candle wax and metal. Lanterns revealed stone walls unmarked by fire, shelves of unburned linen folded neatly in rows, and a large, rusted contraption that no one could name. Pipes wound into the floor like veins, leading toward a drain in the center. Around it, circles had been carved into the stone, precise, deliberate, symmetrical. At first glance, it looked like a workshop, but there was something wrong in the order of it, something too measured to be innocent. A few of the men refused to step inside. Those who did came back pale, muttering about the smell, faint but distinct, like warm milk and iron. They searched for hours but found no sign of life. Only the cellar endured, its walls sweating with condensation even as the air above baked dry. When the coroner arrived days later, he declared the fire an accident. Faulty wiring, perhaps, or spontaneous combustion from the heat. But the townsfolk did not believe him. They spoke instead of a punishment long deferred, a cleansing that had consumed everything but its own foundation. Some claimed that on quiet nights, the hill still glowed faintly, as though something beneath the earth had not stopped burning. Weeks passed before anyone dared return to the site. The orchard was gone, reduced to black stumps that bled sap like tar. The well had cracked open again, its stones split by heat, and though the drought had ended, the water at the bottom remained perfectly still, untouched by reflection. Children from the town crept close sometimes, daring each other to listen. They said they could hear knocking from below, faint but steady like small hands against wood. A year later, the parish built a new orphanage in town, smaller and modern with no chapel and no cellar. Mercy House was left to the weeds. The papers called it a tragedy of devotion, a warning against obsession. But those who had seen the fire, truly seen it, could never forget the way it burned. They said it moved too evenly, too alive, its light pure and wrong, as though it were not fire at all but something older wearing fire's skin. In time, the hill was renamed Hollow's Rise, and the townsfolk learned to avoid it. Yet on some summer nights, when the wind shifts and the air smells faintly of sweetness and smoke, those who pass by swear they see light. Flickering where the house once stood, pale, unwavering, like the glow of candles arranged in a circle. And sometimes if the wind is still, they say they hear a woman's voice carried through the dark, calm and soft as if leading a prayer. All accounted for. All cleansed. By the time the machines came to the hill, Mercy House had long been erased from memory. The locals no longer called it Hollow's Rise, they called it simply the Ridge, a place where nothing grew right. The soil there stayed pale, almost ashen, even when the rest of Blackwater County turned green again. In 1978, a real estate developer from St. Louis bought the land, planning to build modern homes with wide lawns and picture windows. He said the view was perfect, the soil stable, the ground pure. The townsfolk said nothing. They watched the bulldozers climb the hill and turned away, as if watching a grave being opened. The first week passed without incident. Workers leveled the earth, cleared the weeds, poured gravel into the bones of the orchard that had once stood there. But by the second week, when they began digging the foundation for the model house, the ground gave a sound no dirt should make, a dull, hollow crack like glass breaking underground. The men stopped the machine thinking they'd hit stone. But when they shoveled away the clay, what emerged instead was pale, soft, and eerily shaped, something small and round with sockets where light did not belong. They thought it was animal at first until a second one rolled free, then a third, smaller still, its teeth no bigger than grains of rice. The foreman called the sheriff. The sheriff called the county coroner. Soon the hill swarmed with men in hard hats and gloves, their laughter gone, their boots sinking into dirt that suddenly seemed too soft. They dug carefully now, their shovels tracing the edge of a pit that widened with every scoop. By afternoon, the earth began to reveal a pattern. The bones weren't scattered or buried at random. They were arranged, meticulously, deliberately, in circles that spiraled inward, each ring smaller than the last. Hundreds of tiny skeletons, their bones bleached white by time, lay nested in perfect symmetry, each one wrapped in what looked like decayed fabric. The coroner bent close, brushing away the soil. The fabric wasn't fabric at all. It was cloth stiffened by wax, thin layers folded around each body like cocoons. Some still glistened faintly in the sunlight, beads of hardened wax clinging to the threads. When they lifted one bundle, the inside gleamed pale and dry, the bones preserved as if sealed against decay. One of the men turned away to vomit. Another crossed himself without realizing it. The sheriff muttered that it looked more like art than burial, though the word made everyone uneasy. The air had a sweetness to it, faint, cloying like burned candles left too long in a warm room. By nightfall the site was cordoned off. Reporters arrived from Columbia, then Kansas City. The headlines called it, the Orphan Hill Discovery. Archaeologists were brought in, and the excavation began under strict supervision. They worked slowly, photographing every layer. The deeper they went, the clearer the design became. The circles were not just circles. They were patterns of spirals and lines intersecting at precise points, forming something that looked almost like a mandala carved into the earth itself. Each ring of bones faced inward, the skulls turned toward the center. In that center, when they reached it, lay a single object. A small iron key, rusted but intact, resting on a slab of stone blackened by fire. The investigators documented everything. They measured distances, analyzed soil composition, cataloged the remains. But for all their science, they could not answer what the arrangement meant. The bones belonged to children, dozens, maybe hundreds, all under the age of 12. No markers, no coffins, no signs of violence. Only the wax, the precision, and the strange absence of decay. The lead archaeologist, a man named Dr. Meyer, said he had never seen anything like it. He called it ritualistic architecture, the merging of geometry and mortality. The reporters called it madness. The townsfolk called it proof. At the county museum, an old map confirmed what no one wanted to say aloud. The circles lay directly beneath where Mercy House once stood. The cellar, the orchard, the chapel, all gone, but their memory drawn into the ground like a fingerprint. When they overlaid photographs from the fire with the excavation plans, the match was exact. Even the outermost ring of bones aligned with the old foundation stones. Ada Holcomb's name resurfaced then, dredged from the archives. The parish files, long forgotten, told pieces of the story, the fire, the missing records, the whispers of cleansing. The curators thought it coincidence. The locals knew better. When the investigators reopened the old parish vault for context, they found one final relic, a melted brass plaque that had once hung above the orphanage gate. The words were barely legible, but what remained read, "Mercy purifies." Dr. Meyer kept it on his desk for weeks, studying its curve, the way the metal seemed half-eaten by heat yet still whole. He told a journalist it felt as though the fire had avoided it on purpose. "The symmetry of it all," he said quietly, "isn't human." The excavation stretched on for months. Each layer revealed another ring, each ring more compact, the wax thicker, darker. The scientists stopped counting at 200. When the final chamber was reached, near the lowest depth of the foundation, they found what looked like a pit lined with stone. Inside lay several small objects, rosaries melted into lumps, fragments of glass jars, and a single open book preserved in a casing of hardened wax. The pages were fused together, but the cover survived. Plain leather, no title, just the faint imprint of a cross scorched into the center. Forensic teams took it to a lab, where heat imaging later revealed faint lettering burned into the front leaf. It read, "Ledger of the Cleansed." When the discovery was announced publicly, the town fell silent. The construction company withdrew from the project. The developer sold the land back to the county for almost nothing. The state declared it a protected site, though the word protected seemed too small for what they feared. Locals avoided the ridge again, and the few who ventured close at night claimed to hear something beneath the soil, a low rhythmic pulse like distant breathing. Some said they saw candles flickering along the perimeter of the dig, though no one ever found them afterward. In the museum archives, the photographs of the site remain sealed. They say the patterns are too precise, too deliberate, to have been made by accident. The wax preserved every detail, the curve of ribs, the delicate fingers clasped in prayer, the faint impressions of linen folded by careful hands. Each child perfectly arranged, as if laid to rest by someone who loved order more than mercy. Those who studied the case could not agree on the motive. Some called it religion, others psychosis. But the townspeople have another word. They call it completion, the final act of a woman who once preached that salvation could be shaped by human hands, that purity could be cooled, burned, and sealed like wax. Today, nothing grows on the ridge where the excavation once stood. The county fenced it off, citing erosion. But at dusk, when the sun hits the hill just right, the ground seems to shimmer faintly, and the pattern of circles rises through the soil like breath on glass, pale outlines of order carved into earth that refuses to forget. It was discovered by accident, 3 months after the excavation had ended. The county planned to seal the ridge permanently, pouring concrete over what remained of Mercy House's foundations. A final inspection was ordered. As workers cleared away the last of the debris, one of them struck something buried in the cornerstone of the old chapel wall, a hollow block, its surface blackened but intact. When they pried it open, a small tin box sat inside, wrapped in linen hardened by age and wax. Inside that, a bundle of yellowed pages tied with string. The handwriting was fine and deliberate, ink faded but legible. The first page bore a single title, written in a hand so steady it looked printed, "The Doctrine of Mercy, a Confession by Miss Ada Holcomb, 1913. The letter was taken to the county archives, where historians and priests alike gathered in uneasy curiosity. What they found was not confession as they expected it, no plea for forgiveness, no apology for sin. It was methodical, like notes from a scientist recording the conclusion of her life's work. Her tone was calm, her words exact, her logic twisted but chillingly coherent. She began with a declaration, "I have seen the face of mercy, and it is cold." She wrote of the floods of 1905, how she had waded through the ruined church, the drowned infants, the silence that followed. "I prayed," she wrote, "but the prayers did not rise. They stayed beneath the water, heavy and waiting. When the voice came, it was not God, but something that had listened too long in the dark. It said, 'Cleanse what the water could not touch.'" Ada described how she had felt chosen, not for kindness but for clarity. She wrote of the children left in her care, souls unformed, soft as wax, and how she saw in them the chance to rebuild the world cleanly. "Sin," she said, "is a fever of the flesh. Fire reveals it, but cold preserves its shape. Between the two I found balance." She detailed her experiments in mercy, her theory that purity could be measured not in prayer, but in temperature. The body cooled, the voice stilled, the soul lightened. They did not suffer, she claimed. Suffering belongs to the impure. The pure simply stop. She spoke of the quiet room as though it were a chapel. It was not torture, she insisted. It was translation. The soul must be taught stillness before it can rise. Her language was neither defensive nor proud. It was instructional, written as though she expected future generations to continue her work. Each paragraph read like an equation between faith and anatomy. "Heat is confession," she wrote. "Cold is grace. Wax is memory, sealing what was once flawed." Halfway through, the letter shifted. The tone grew more intimate, more fractured. She began referring to the voice in the walls. At first, she called it her companion, the listener who reminded me what to do when I grew afraid. Then, gradually, her certainty cracked. The voice grows louder when the children sleep. It hums the hymns I cannot remember. Sometimes it uses my mouth. Sometimes it forgets that it is not me. Her words looped between clarity and delusion, between theology and confession. She described walking the halls at night, hearing soft knocks beneath the floorboards, their prayers echoing upward, asking to be finished. In one passage, she claimed the fire was not an accident. The walls asked for it, she wrote. They said the wax was full, that the light must come. It was not destruction. It was blooming. She spoke of arranging the children in the cellar, wrapping them carefully in cloth soaked with wax. Not burial, but preservation, the chrysalis of spirit. Each layer of linen, she explained, was a prayer hardened into permanence. They are not gone, she wrote. They are waiting in order, their silence the first note of a new hymn. The investigators read these lines aloud in stunned silence. The words carried no trace of madness as they understood it, only a terrifying serenity. Ada had rationalized everything, built a theology of cruelty so complete it resembled reason. Her final paragraphs read like scripture, dense with certainty. The Lord made me his surgeon, she wrote. He cut through mercy and showed me what lay beneath, the pure anatomy of the soul. Fire was my final test. The voice told me to walk through it. I obeyed. I felt nothing. I do not think the body that burned was mine. The last page was different. The handwriting trembled now, the ink darker, pressed deep into the paper. The voice is quiet, she wrote. It has gone below. The children whisper from the well. They say they are cold but clean. They say I may rest. But rest is not for the chosen. Then, a single line written almost gently, when the earth remembers me, light the wax again. The archivists debated for months whether the letter was genuine. The age of the paper, the ink, even the language matched the early 20th century. The church refused to acknowledge it publicly, but copies circulated quietly among scholars. Some called it delusion born of trauma. Others saw in it the pattern of ritual psychology, the merging of sanctity and science. But there were details in the confession that no outsider could have known. The exact dimensions of the cellar, the arrangement of the pipes, the reference to a ledger hidden beneath the altar stone. When investigators checked the site again, they found the remnants of that stone precisely where she described. To this day, the confession remains sealed in a climate-controlled archive, its images too disturbing for public release. But those who have read it say the words seem to change depending on who reads them. Some pages appear damp as if sweating wax. Others carry a faint scent of smoke. A few claim they heard a hum, a low rhythmic vibration that seemed to rise from the paper itself, steady as breath. The church has since declared the hill unconsecrated ground. No structures are permitted to stand there now. Yet each year, on the anniversary of the fire, a faint glow appears beneath the soil, not flame but something softer, flickering in circles. The wind carries a scent of sweetness, and those who pass by swear they hear a woman's voice, calm and steady, whispering words that do not burn. I have seen the face of mercy, she said, and it is cold. After the fire of 1913, the Diocese of Jefferson quietly assumed ownership of the hill. The transaction appeared in no newspaper, mentioned in no sermon. The deed was filed in a back office beneath the parish hall, stamped, folded, and forgotten. On paper, the reason was preservation, to protect the site of tragedy from desecration. In truth, it was erasure. The church understood the value of silence. The land was fenced, the ruins cleared, and Mercy House vanished from public record as though it had never stood. No memorial, no plaque, not even a prayer. Only the faint scent of wax that clung to the soil long after the ashes had cooled. Within a year, the archives of the orphanage were transferred to diocesan storage. Boxes of letters, baptismal lists, expense ledgers, all sealed, catalogued as non-essential. When clerks later tried to locate them, they found gaps in every log. Pages removed. Dates rewritten. Names replaced by numbers. The sisters who had served under Ada Holcomb were reassigned to convents far from Blackwater, their vows of silence renewed under the guise of penitential retreat. Some died there, old and voiceless, still whispering prayers they did not understand. One priest who questioned the official report was sent to Rome and never returned. Those who remained learned the lesson quickly. Certain stories are not meant for retelling. The church's narrative was simple, polished, and safe. A tragedy of structure and fire, a loss of innocent life, an act of divine mystery. In the diocesan annuals, Mercy House was summarized in a single line: destroyed by flame, July 1913. May the children rest in eternal light. No mention of experiments, no ledger, no cellar. Just an ending written with the efficiency of mercy. The town accepted it because belief is easier when it fits the shape of forgiveness. Through the 1920s and 30s, the hill remained empty, a patch of land the church refused to sell. Parish budgets listed it as reserved ground. Yet money continued to flow. Donations with no donors, accounts balanced by invisible hands. Bank statements bore initials instead of names. The sums were small but consistent, trickling into the diocesan fund like tithe from ghosts. Every few years, a new bishop inherited the property, asked about its purpose and was told the same thing: it is consecrated. Leave it be. Each accepted the answer, perhaps relieved by the clarity of not knowing more. In time, the story of the orphanage faded into folklore. Children dared each other to climb the hill, to listen at the old well said to hum beneath the weeds. Adults dismissed it as nonsense. The archives grew dust-heavy, their contents forgotten beneath layers of newer scandals. Bureaucracy did what sin never could: it made horror ordinary. The church, like the land, learned to harden around its secrets. But silence has a half-life. In 2009, a graduate researcher from the University of Missouri began digitizing parish records for her thesis on post-flood reconstruction. Her work was routine until she found a gap, a missing file number between two orphanage reports from 1907 and 1913. Curious, she searched further and found entire ledgers omitted from the diocesan database. When she requested physical access, the archivist refused, citing fire damage. Yet the index labels still listed titles: Ledger of the Cleansed, Doctrine of Mercy, Temperance Log. The researcher pressed harder, filing a request under the Freedom of Information Act. Within weeks, her university received an anonymous letter from the diocese, offering a donation for her department in exchange for closing the inquiry. The letter was polite, signed by no one. She declined. Months later, the sealed boxes were quietly uncrated for digitization under federal supervision. Inside, investigators found fragments of documents matching descriptions from the excavation. Ada's name, the orphanage accounts, and pages cross-referenced with missing baptismal records from surrounding parishes. It became clear that dozens of children had been transferred on paper but never existed beyond Mercy House. The church's ledgers had rewritten them into bureaucratic ghosts, filed, stamped, and erased in one stroke. Even the donations matched patterns. Each anonymous tithe coincided with the date of a child's disappearance. When the findings leaked to the press, the diocese issued a single statement. It expressed deep sorrow for any historical irregularities and pledged cooperation with authorities. No mention of Ada Holcomb. No mention of the bones. The investigation closed within a year, deemed inconclusive. But the data was now online, searchable, public. For the first time in nearly a century, the story began to breathe again. Historians and journalists pieced together fragments. Old photographs, letters, Ada's recovered confession. Every revelation only deepened the mystery. How had one woman's delusion persisted through decades of clerical oversight? How many signatures, how many seals, how many quiet approvals did it take for horror to pass as holiness? The answer, it seemed, was all of them. Today, the Diocese of Jefferson still owns the ridge. The deed remains unchanged, the boundary lines maintained, the soil undisturbed. The church insists it is barren, unsuitable for construction. But locals say the grass there glows faintly at night as if lit from beneath. They say that when the wind is still, you can hear pages turning in the dark, soft, papery whispers reciting numbers instead of prayers. Each sound measured, each silence recorded. And though the church may have bought the land to bury its shame, the ground has learned its own kind of memory. Because evil once written does not vanish. It files itself neatly, binds its corners, stamps its seal in red wax and waits, patient, silent, eternal, for the next archivist to open the box. The memorial is small, almost modest, a stone arch flanked by iron gates that lead nowhere. It stands at the top of the hill where Mercy House once breathed its measured darkness, overlooking the same stretch of Missouri fields that once carried the scent of river mud and smoke. Tourists pass it without pause, thinking it quaint, another relic of small-town tragedy preserved for conscience's sake. There is a plaque, polished and neat, engraved with words chosen by a committee, in memory of the lost children of Blackwater. May their souls rest in grace. Flowers are sometimes left there, though never by family. There are no families left to remember. The town keeps the grass trimmed, the path swept, the silence undisturbed. Yet the air is colder here, the soil reluctant to warm even under August sun. It feels as if the earth itself draws breath slowly, unwilling to forget what it once held. Locals speak of the place carefully as though language might wake it. The hill is not cursed, they say, only weary. On certain winter mornings, when fog clings low and pale frost edges the memorial stones, the ground exhales, a slow drift of vapor that rises through the cracks in the path like the faintest sigh. Scientists claim it is nothing more than temperature and moisture, the residue of underground springs long dried. But old families in town still cross themselves when they see it. They say it's the breath of the quiet rooms, the last whisper of those who were taught to pray in silence. The memorial was built in 1987 after decades of controversy, after the confessions surfaced and the archives were forced open. The church funded it through an anonymous trust, careful not to name itself, careful to appear generous without admitting guilt. Officials called it a step toward healing, a gesture of peace. They spoke of faith renewed and forgiveness reclaimed. But beneath the marble and the flowers, the ground remains restless. The foundation stones crack faster than they should. The grass over the old cellar grows a deeper green than anywhere else. When it rains, puddles form in perfect circles, as though marking the spaces where beds once stood. Historians still argue over Ada Holcomb, whether she was mad, possessed, or simply obedient to the darker logic of her time. Some see her as a monster, others as a symptom. But the truth no longer belongs to psychology or theology. It belongs to the quiet mechanisms that allowed her to thrive. The letters never mailed, the ledgers rewritten, the whispers dismissed as rumor. The horror was not in her hands alone but in every silence that surrounded her. For every child she cleansed, there was a signature approving her budget, a priest blessing her chapel, a town grateful for her kindness. Evil wears many faces, but the one it favors most is the face that smiles while taking notes. Visitors often remark on the peace of the memorial, how still it feels, how complete. They do not hear what lingers beneath the quiet. If they stood longer, they might notice the faint echo of water beneath the ground, the rhythmic pulse of something trapped between history and soil. They might feel the chill that rises through their shoes, seeping upward like the slow memory of touch. They might sense that the land is listening. Because this place remembers the sound of small prayers fading under floorboards, the weight of wet linen, the calm precision of a woman convinced that mercy could be engineered. Every October, a candlelight vigil is held by the local parish. Children read the names of the departed, though no true records exist. The same 21 names are repeated each year, chosen from fragments and guesses. The bishop blesses the air, the crowd hums a hymn, and the candles flicker against the wind. The ceremony is short, efficient, designed to comfort. But after the last light dies, a few attendees stay behind, claiming they feel something move beneath the dirt, not a tremor, not a sound, but a shift like breath turning in sleep. They never speak of it aloud, only glance back once as they leave, as if unsure whether they have paid respects or disturbed a wound. There is a new school now at the base of the hill, bright and modern, its classrooms filled with laughter. Children play without knowing what lies beneath them. Teachers tell them the memorial honors those who helped others long ago. The truth has been softened again, shaped into something easier to teach. History prefers it that way, smoothed, corrected, wrapped in polite language until cruelty looks like care. And so, the lesson endures not in books but in the temperature of the soil, in the breath of the ground that refuses to cool. If you visit the hill at night, when the wind stops and the frost creeps in from the fields, you might see the air stir faintly around the memorial arch. You might feel it brush your skin, that cold, thin exhale that carries neither smoke nor scent, only memory. And in that moment you might wonder what truly ended here and what merely learned to wait. They say the ground still exhales on winter nights. What do you think? Could something like this happen again, hidden behind faith, paperwork, and good intentions?